and I'm going to project nice and loud. Can you hear me in the back? Wonderful. Welcome. The SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco acknowledges our presence on the unceded land of the indigenous Ohlone communities and pays our respects to these traditional caretakers and elders past, present, and emerging. It is our intention that this acknowledgement plays a role, however small, in a much larger process of confronting the past in order to create a not yet realized future rooted in justice. Welcome to the first event of the fall 2024 semester of the University of San Francisco SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. Tonight, we will learn from Jonathan Branfman, who will draw from his book, Millennial Jewish Stars, Navigating Racial Antisemitism, Masculinity, and White Supremacy. My name is Rabbi Chel Mandel, and I direct the JEDI plus JSSJ program here at USF. I want to begin by thanking the JSSJ faculty and staff for the help in organizing this event tonight. Before introducing tonight's program, I'd like to take a brief moment to tell you about the extraordinary University in Jewish Studies and Social Justice program. Founded in 1855, USF is our city's first university. Our tagline, "Change the world from here," is legit. With 9,000 plus undergraduate and graduate students, U.S. News and World Report says that we are the #1 most diverse campus in the country in terms of racial and ethnic makeup. An educational institution where 1/3 of our undergrads are the first of their families to attend college. We estimate that 10% of our student body identify as Jewish and some 30% identify as queer. A premier Jesuit Catholic school, in 1977, we became the first Catholic institution in the world to endow a Jewish studies program. In 2008, we became the first university of any kind, Catholic or otherwise, to have an academic program formally linking Jewish studies and social justice. In 2019, we added yet another first to our renowned history by forming a new position on campus, that of Rabbi in Residence. And more recently, in fall 2023, we launched the country's first ever graduate level certificate in JEDI, in JSSJ, which is Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. The graduate program gives professionals the opportunity to learn from both scholars and activists, offering a blend of academic study and real-world application. In the classroom, we offer a wide range of significant Jewish studies courses not found in other educational settings. Beyond the classroom, we offer unique events that are free and open to the public, such as tonight's. Through the SWIG and JSSJ program, we believe that education is the best long-term way to create systemic change. Whether one has the time to take a semester-long course or a mere few hours to hear from a single speaker. Education is fundamental to making our world better, paramount in shining the spotlight on the margins, on oppressed communities who are mistreated merely because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or any other social identity altogether. Tonight is the first of many events. I'm going to list a few more starting on October 16th. We will have our sukkah standing on campus for all to join in our nightly programming, and there's some daytime programming. The sukkah is a temporary dwelling place that is erected to experience what the Israelites did at one time. The command is to gather in the sukkah, learn, eat, an open space for all to join. A few highlights are opening night, called Guests on Indigenous Land with Rabbi Farron Varela from Or Shalom on October 16th, 6:30 to 8 p.m. And a day later, on the 17th, from 6:30 to 8 p.m., we will hear from Asaf Elia Shalev on Israel's Black Panthers, the radicals that punctured a nation's founding myth. Another highlight will be Dr. Joy Layden's talk called Body, Soul, Gender, and God, Trans and Non-Binary Identities in the Art of Being Human on Wednesday, October 23rd, 4 to 5 p.m. over Zoom. Join us for this and more in the sukkah. If you'd like to learn more about these events, sign up for a newsletter in the back. There's a QR code, or come talk to me at the end of the event. Now, on tonight's program, Getting Racy, Race, Anti-Semitism, and Millennial Jewish Stars. Our keynote speaker, Jonathan Branfman, who will draw from his new book, Millennial Jewish Stars, Navigating Racial Antisemitism, Masculinity, and White Supremacy. Many well-intentioned people lack the tools to notice anti-Semitism at all. Likewise, many people struggled to explain how anti-Semitism can impact Jews with white skin, like actor Seth Rogen, and Jews of color like rap star Drake, in different ways. By illuminating how Jewish pop culture stars navigate these issues on screen, we can deepen our understanding of how anti-Semitism shapes everyday perceptions, biases, and behaviors in real life. We will learn about Jonathan's research through a conversation and Q&A with Professor Noah Bar Gabai. Thank you, sorry. Welcome, come on up. The mics are on their way, so let's just talk nice and loud.
Hi, everyone. Hi, John.
Hi, good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So we are here to talk about this fascinating book. And I have so many questions, and you really managed to weave together the old and the new, the urgent, the fun, the not so fun. But I guess even before I ask about the book, I just wanted to step back and ask, why pop culture? Why is that, like, we don't often think of that as the subject of academic studies, so why did you choose pop culture to look at anti-Semitism?
Great question. And first, thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me. Can folks in the back hear? Cool. So you're right, pop culture doesn't always seem like a logical place to start for dealing with really serious issues like anti-Semitism and race. But pop culture can take these topics that can seem far away and abstract and show people that they're actually vivid parts of our own everyday lives. So as a really concrete example, frequently, if I'm talking to any group, whether it's friends or my parents' friends or students, and if I ask them, do you think anti-Semitism shapes your own perceptions of the world? People often will just say no, or just look at me very confused and not even really be sure what I'm asking. But then if I show them a picture of the film star Zac Efron and say, does he look Jewish? Frequently, groups of people will burst out laughing and say, no, absolutely not. He doesn't look Jewish. And then it's an opportunity to say, oh, interesting. Why? And then people will invariably say, his eyes are so blue, his hair is so light, his nose is so small, he's so handsome, he's so buff. And so then it turns out that these folks who thought they didn't know anything about anti-Semitism or that it had nothing to do with them actually have internalized this very detailed catalog of how Jewish bodies are supposed to look. And this catalog is actually intersecting with their perceptions of color, because obviously they don't perceive Jews with white skin as non-white, and yet they do have certain expectations about how Jewish bodies are supposed to physically differ from white Christian bodies or other types of bodies. And so then once we've used Zac Efron to establish this conversation, thank you so much. How we doing? Okay. Sorry.
I can project.
Thank you so much. Round of applause.
I may have to get a second.
Okay, I can also just talk about that.
But so once we've used Zac Efron as this kind of entry point to establish a shared awareness of these issues, then we can kind of step back and have a conversation about where did these ideas come from? How did they historically originate? Out of an 800-year history of religious texts and art and theater and opera and early film, and how have these much older images shaped our present-day pop culture and actually come to shape our everyday lives. And so I like to say anti-Semitism and race can seem abstract to people, but they're really as familiar to many of us as our favorite sitcom or star. And that's why I wrote about pop culture.
I see, it's in our midst.
Yeah.
So I think this is kind of related to what you were bringing up in terms of, I don't think this is working. Is it working? No? Okay. It's what? It's coming? Can you hear me though? Can you hear me? That Jews occupy, well, there are so many different kinds of Jews of so many different identities, but you in your book use the phrase Euro-Jews. And they are white-skinned, but they have a difference from Christian bodies, I guess, right? And so I wonder if that's related to a term in your title here, racial anti-Semitism, right? Because we've heard of racism and we've heard of anti-Semitism. So why racial anti-Semitism?
Great question. And Racial antisemitism describes a stigma that imagines Jewish bodies as physically different from and inferior to white Christian bodies. And just to make sure I'm clarifying, in the book I don't argue that there actually is any observable difference between Jewish or non-Jewish bodies. I'm analyzing the kind of history of how European and American societies have imagined this difference and asserted it through, for example, images in art or film or now digital media as well. And you're right that it can be difficult to articulate how racial antisemitism intersects with skin color. So I think on one hand, with many of us, actually I'm interested to see a show of hands. Show of hands if you've ever had a moment when somebody said to you the misguided statement that, I couldn't possibly have white privilege because I'm Jewish. Or if you've heard something along those lines. I see a few people raising their hands. Or conversely, if you've heard somebody make the misguided statement that anti-Semitism doesn't matter because lots of Jews have white skin. Again, seeing some hands. I'm actually glad to see that not that many people have heard these statements, because I gotta tell you that they're quite common in some spaces. And I think generally in the US, we lack the vocabulary to describe how racism based on skin color could intersect with other racial stigmas. We tend to think of race as only a matter of color. And so my hope in this book is actually to use popular culture to provide new tools for us to think about all these dimensions at once. So for example, that we can take seriously that somebody like Alana Glazer experiences all kinds of white privilege because of her skin color and can simultaneously be targeted for racial stigmas, sometimes including violence, because of her Jewishness. So like the most concrete examples could be somebody like Alana Glazer or myself. We are generally racially safe from police violence, but racially vulnerable to far-right violence, like the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. So that's the type of analysis in terms of race that I hope to provide in the book.
Mm-hmm. So what does masculinity have to do with it?
Great question. Like why is masculinity in the title? What does that have to do with race? I mentioned a moment ago, in the US, we tend to think of race as only or primarily about skin color, but historically a lot of the racial stigmas on Jews also targeted gender and depicted Jews as having a different or deviant kind of gender and sexuality in comparison to white Christians. So for instance, stereotypes of Jewish men as emasculated and Jewish women as masculinized. For instance, in the 13 and 1400s, there were accusations that Jewish men menstruate. And this was part of imagining Jewish bodies as not just religiously different, but physically different. And this focus on masculinity as a kind of stigma related to race is also helpful, again, for thinking about how anti-Semitism intersects with skin color. Because, for example, somebody like Drake, there's lots to say about Drake, especially recently. But zooming out from that for a moment, throughout his career, he has had to publicly navigate the opposite racial stereotypes about black hypermasculinity and Jewish emasculation. For instance, right when he kind of first started getting big in 2010, he had an interview with Katie Couric, and the very first question she asked him was, "What's a nice Jewish boy doing in a field like this?" And show of hands, who's ever heard the phrase "nice Jewish boy"? Okay. Familiar to many people.
Well, nice Jewish girl, I think, is what you hear more often.
Oh, interesting.
Or maybe.
Interesting. I don't know. I suppose I've heard both.
Okay.
But nice Jewish boy, it's this image of Jewish men as sort of soft and sweet, and it is a much gentler version of older stigmas that much more harshly imagined Jewish men as emasculated. But that's just like one case of Drake publicly having to navigate a kind of conflicting bodily assumptions about Jewishness and blackness that might not be visible if we looked at color alone.
Yeah, I see. And so you've mentioned a couple of times the kind of long historical arc of your book, that there are these 800-year-old stereotypes, that a lot of them are found in Christian art of the medieval era. And I guess that is surprising when it's a book about pop culture. So are these things, they're still relevant?
Yeah. I can't remember who made this quote, but there's a quote I really like. Our pleasures have a history. And that certainly applies to popular culture. And not only to images of Jews, but depictions of all different groups, certainly including people of color, including women, both white and of color, Jews and non-Jews, Arab Americans. There's like a really long artistic history behind any of the images that we're consuming. As another example related to anti-Black racism, if we think about early 20th century cartoons, including Bugs Bunny cartoons, where there are characters who are sometimes explicitly blackface characters, but certainly modeled on blackface performances. The legacy of blackface goes back not only to the 1800s in the US, but even in some cases medieval or early modern plays in Europe in which European performers were painting their faces black. Or if you think of the character Othello in Shakespearean plays, frequently played, or I would say almost always historically played by non-black actors, often wearing face paint. And I think generally when we watch Bugs Bunny cartoons, we don't think of that as in any way descending from Shakespeare or anything like that. But all of our contemporary pop culture, including our depictions of folks like Drake or Ilana Glazer, come out of a long history.
When you do in the book use a term that I have never quite come across, which is goy face.
Yes.
So is that related to this history of minstrelsy, and what is goy face, and how does Zac Efron do it?
Sure, thank you for asking. And I think to answer that question, I have to take a step back and maybe give a broader definition about minstrelsy. Show of hands who has heard the term minstrelsy, or blackface minstrelsy? So some folks. So just to clarify, minstrelsy is a performance genre that includes caricaturing different groups, usually racial groups. Most Americans are at least passingly familiar with the phenomenon of blackface minstrelsy, non-black performers painting their faces black and caricaturing black people. There's also histories in the US of yellowface minstrelsy, caricaturing Asian Americans, brownface minstrelsy, caricaturing people who are South Asian, Latinx, Arab American, redface minstrelsy, caricaturing Native Americans, and Jewface minstrelsy, in which non-Jewish performers would use cosmetics like a fake nose or a big curly dark wig or curly black beard to impersonate and mock Jewishness. And I think actually before talking about Zac Efron, a helpful other image is to look at one of the other stars I write about, whose name is, or whose stage name is Little Dicky. Show of hands who's familiar with the rapper Little Dicky. So Little Dicky, as you might guess from his stage name, leans hard into racial stereotypes about Jewish bodies, and particularly stereotypes of Jewish emasculation. But what I found in the book is that he performs a kind of Jewface not through blatant cosmetics, but by subtly accentuating the traits that he already has. So his body is a body that already happens to match popular stereotypes about Jewish bodies, whereas, for example, Zac Efron's does not. And then through cinematography and lighting and camera angles and other kind of techniques, Little Dicky encourages the audience to focus on these traits and see him as this exaggerated caricature. So for example, in this music video, Jewish Flow from 2013, this is his first shot where he appears in profile backlit so that the light is outlining his nose as well as his curly hair. So throughout the book, actually in each chapter, I found that each of the stars I write about, they're all doing different types of minstrelsy, all in this subtle variety that is not so blatant as like a wig or a fake nose. And that leads us to Zac Efron. Show of hands, who is familiar with the term goy? Can we get a definition? Yes.
Well, it's come to mean non-Jew, but it really means nation.
Yes, so goy is a word that originally meant nation, and then in Yiddish means non-Jew, and it's sort of dismissive. Like in the same way that I think in a lot of queer communities, there can be moments when queer folks with each other will just be like, oh, what's going on with the straight people? Goy has that sort of connotation when Jewish communities are like, what is this dominant group? What is going on with that group? And it can be a way of expressing, I think, a certain frustration with mistreatment or other aspects of that dynamic. But I chose the word goy face to describe how some of Zac Efron's performances caricature white Gentile masculinity. Show of hands who's seen the movie Neighbors. If you haven't, I don't know if I recommend it, but if you want to learn about goy face, watch that movie. So shortly before Neighbors came out, Zac Efron publicly came out as Jewish for the first time. He had never ever mentioned being Jewish. And then he and Seth Rogen, who co-starred together in Neighbors, in a promo for Neighbors, had this whole shtick on YouTube where Zac Efron says, like, here's a bombshell, I'm Jewish. And then Seth Rogen reacts with surprise and is like, you don't look Jewish. So they not only name Zac Efron's Jewishness, but really play up the idea that his body wildly mismatches Jewishness. And then, I think a month after that, this movie premiered, where Zac Efron plays this over-the-top, ridiculous caricature of a white Gentile frat boy. He's very buffoonish. For instance, well, we can go into specific examples, but to make a long story only a little bit longer, Zac Efron's Jewface roles play on the perceived contradiction between his invisible internal Jewish identity and his body that is perceived as not just Gentile-looking, but super-duper Gentile-looking. And that tension allows him, without really many cosmetics, to present himself as like a Jewish performer wearing an exaggerated white Gentile mask. And that is where the comedy of some of his movies come in. Neighbors, Neighbors 2, Mike and Dave Need Wedding Dates, and Baywatch. I do recommend Baywatch.
So is there a way in which then, in your analysis, masculinity does the work of racial difference?
Yes, absolutely.
In other words, it's not, Euro Jews have sometimes whiter skin. It's hard to say that they're not white, although they're ambivalently white, but they're whitish or white, right? And so then, and yet, as you say, the Jewish body is marked as different from the Christian body, and so is that what happens with a highly stereotyped male masculinity?
Yes, absolutely. So you said it very beautifully that often masculine stereotypes do the work of racial differentiation in the way that Americans imagine Jewish and Gentile bodies. But then it's so complicated because so many people who assume these stereotypes and like think through them, or what's the right word? Many people whose thinking is shaped by these stereotypes every day would never consciously describe Jewishness as a race. And so there can be this very interesting disconnect between what people think they think about Jewishness versus what they actually assume about Jewish bodies. So for example, going back to Zac Efron, many people who are shocked that Zac Efron is Jewish would totally say that they just see Jewishness as a religion or a culture and has nothing to do with race, and yet this image comes on screen, and invariably in my classes, somebody will say, Zac Efron is Jewish? So that the way that it functions as a subconscious racial lens that is not acknowledged by the people who do it is really interesting.
Right, like it's hiding in plain sight.
Yes, hiding in plain sight, I like that.
And is there a way in which Drake kind of is the opposite pole, or has kind of an inverse relationship to this kind of triad of masculinity, race, anti-Semitism?
Definitely a different relationship. I started the book with Drake and ended it with Zac Efron because they are both so opposite and so similar. So people how to put this? When I mention Drake or Zac Efron, the verbal reactions are frequently identical. People will say like, Drake is Jewish? Zac Efron is Jewish? And then the reasons for those reactions are both opposite and similar. People perceive Drake as too black, Zac Efron as too white, and both as too handsome and muscular to look Jewish. And so they make kind of mirrors for each other in interesting ways. I think with Drake, he is simultaneously dealing with the explicit racial stigmas on blackness and the implicit or unacknowledged racial stigmas on Jewishness. And then it's also more complicated for Drake. Show of hands who's ever seen any performances or interviews by Drake?
Performances or what?
Or interviews by Drake. Who here knows who Drake is? Okay, cool. Literally every single aspect of Drake's appearance, identity, upbringing, and public image, they all connote different masculinities that are incompatible with each other. So he is a black biracial rapper who got his start on a Canadian cheesy soap opera playing a sweet middle-class artistic student who ends up in a wheelchair and who specifically has an episode about erectile dysfunction. Degrassi High.
That wasn't cheesy, that was...
You're right, it wasn't cheesy, my bad, I'm sorry. And he was specifically raised in a Jewish neighborhood of Toronto, attended a Jewish school. He, based on his early interviews and his early performances, it really seems like his kind of native dialect of English that he grew up speaking was white middle-class Canadian English, but then in many of his more recent performances, he is in some ways imitating Black American vernacular, and that's one of the reasons why in the recent diss tracks from Kendrick Lamar says things like, I hate the way that you talk. It's a commentary on this idea that Drake is improperly imitating American blackness. And so, whereas a lot of the other performers might simultaneously be juggling what does white skin mean and what does Jewishness mean, Drake is simultaneously navigating what does blackness mean? Light-skinned blackness, Canadian blackness, middle-class blackness, soap opera to rapper blackness, and Jewishness, all at the same time. And certainly, if there's time in a few minutes, I would love to talk a little bit more about how he juggles that, but he is definitely confronted with a much more complicated juggling act than the other performers.
Because he has many assaults on his authenticity, so to speak, from many fronts.
Yes, absolutely. And what was I going to say? Specifically this idea that every single dimension of his identity means something different that cannot fit together with each other in popular perception. Like, even to be Canadian and a black rapper is often seen as like incomprehensible in America, where so much of the history of rap, first of all, was created in the Bronx by black Americans, but because of this history, often to be seen as an authentic rapper, there's this notion that one must have kind of community ties to black American communities, as particularly, for instance, Bronx or Compton. And to be clear, this is not like my own original research that says this. There's a wonderful field of black feminist studies and specifically hip-hop feminisms about this history, like the work of Treva Lindsay.
I mean, I think it's also something that's becoming more and more relatable, right? As our identities become more diverse, more complex, more intersectional. So Drake is, an illustration of how there can be so many contradictions and questions and even, criticisms that seem really somewhat, I guess, to put it simply, unfair. But this is something that's becoming maybe more and more relatable to millennials and, Gen Z, Zoomers. I don't know if we accept those labels, but that that there's something more relevant to this sort of younger generation of stars, right? As opposed to, say, like Fran Drescher or Jerry Seinfeld, who I guess are like boomer. I hate to lean so much on these, generational labels, but the point is you are focusing on, it is called Millennial Jewish Stars.
Yes.
So is that because our identities are becoming increasingly more complex because so many more of us can relate to that? Does it have to do with how pop culture is filtered to us today, that it wasn't, say, in the 90s where like some of us were there, but most of us weren't there, but some were.
Great question. So one reason why I focused on Millennial Jewish Stars is because in the 2000s to 2010s, there was this real reversal in how explicitly Jewish a character or performer could be in American pop culture and still be accepted. There is this historical kind of tension between presence and erasure for Jews in American popular culture. So on one hand, as I'm sure many folks know, there were many Jews who participated in the founding of Hollywood, many Jewish performers. Sometimes this is also kind of translated into the anti-Semitic notion that, quote, the Jews run Hollywood, which implies not only that there would be many Jewish performers, but that they're supposedly all like plotting something together. But either way, there is this frequent assumption that because there have been many Jewish performers or producers, that would automatically translate into a lot of open and accurate representation for Jewish characters, and that actually has not been the case. Just like, or without overcomplating, there are similarities to the way that there have always been lots of queer folks in show business, but there have not always been a lot of queer characters. Because historically there was this notion that in order for a queer and or Jewish person to be marketable, to be hired, for their characters to be seen as desirable for mainstream audiences, that you just have to closet all of that. And so there's this history of Jewish stars changing their names. Like, show of hands, who's heard of the early 20th century Jewish star Kirk Douglas? A few people. Ask your grandparents. But Kirk Douglas, maybe it's like an exaggeration to call him the Chris Hemsworth of the early 20th century, but like action bro. But his birth name actually was Isor Danielovich. So it kind of shows you how drastically he had to rebrand to be marketable. And between 1930 and 1990, there were very few openly Jewish characters in American film or television. Some, like a few, but not a ton. And then starting in the 90s is when Jerry Seinfeld and Fran Drescher kind of had this breakthrough by creating two sitcoms starring themselves as openly Jewish New Yorkers. But even then, they faced a lot of pressure to closet their Jewishness. Fran Drescher was pressured to restyle her Jewish leading lady as Italian and non-Jewish. And it's interesting, even though these shows are regarded as breakthroughs, still to this day I have students who grew up watching The Nanny who did think that Fran was Italian and didn't catch that she was Jewish. Because even these breakthrough shows never actually, or rarely, use the words Jew or Jewish. Instead, they use this kind of more subtle approach called double coding, where a character is implied to be Jewish through their hair or their body language or their accent. But if you don't know the community really well, and if you happen to, be tying your shoelaces at a moment when a character says oy vey, it can totally go over your head. And that's based on the assumption, to quote, now I can't remember who said this, the assumption that some audiences are ready to change channels at the first sign of a Stein. Stein being a very Jewish last name. But so in the 2000s, it's really when, for the first time, you have characters and performers very openly calling themselves Jews or Jewish. So for example, show of hands, who has seen the TV show Broad City with Alana Glazer and Xavier? Okay, a few folks. If you haven't, it's interesting. But so in the first 4 minutes of the TV show Broad City, Alana and her co-star refer to themselves as Jewesses, which is a very outdated term that most people probably hadn't even heard until the show debuted because it fell out of American usage. Yes.
Yeah, it's darn it.
But and then really since the 1940s, very few Americans had used it. So for characters to call themselves Jewesses and then for the show to still be wildly marketable, really signals this sea change. So in terms of writing about how racial anti-Semitism works and how it shapes popular perceptions, it was helpful to look at stars who are really, really directly engaging with their Jewishness, rather than stars who are just hinting at it.
I think, from what I remember too, she made references on the show to her ambiguous racial identity many times that she could have, maybe be sort of chameleon-like.
Yes, I'm really glad you brought this up. So on Broad City, Alana does have many lines like this. There's an episode called In Heat, where there's a heat wave in New York, and she says, the heat is heightening all my senses, including my ethnic ambiguity. Which is, it's presented as a joke, but it's actually quite problematic because on the show, Alana's character sometimes uses her ethnic ambiguity in ways that are appropriative. And we can certainly talk more about that, but I think it may actually be helpful to give a little more racial context about the word Jewess. Is it okay if we go there?
Of course.
So something that may be less familiar today. The word Jewess doesn't just mean a woman who is Jewish. It comes with a lot of very specific racial and gender stereotypes. So to pull up examples from 19th century art, this is a 19th century painting of the biblical character Salome in the style of the Beautiful Jewess. And Beautiful Jewess was this phrase really from the 1300s onward, but kind of peaked late 1800s, early 1900s, that imagined Jewish women as both racially and genderly ambiguous. So this notion of Jewish women as externally seductive, but internally masculinized and dangerous. Kind of based on biblical characters like Judith, whose name means Jewess. And as you may know, has everyone heard of Judith in the Bible? Famous for seducing an enemy general only to chop his head off with a sword once she's got him in bed. Externally feminized, internally having traits associated with masculinity, like violence, aggression, and being good with a sword. And in addition to this gender ambiguity, Jewess characters were seen as racially ambiguous. You can see in this image of Salome, she's associated with the Near East through her clothing, through her dark hair. So that combination of light skin, dark hair, clothing that evokes the Middle East, those were Jewess vibes. And to give just one other image of this, this is a painting of Judith by Klimt from 1901. The gold and translucent clothing kind of highlights this notion of racial exoticism, but also seduction and danger. And if we look at this image of Judith, including the sort of serpentine scales, she's seductive in a sinful and dangerous way. If we then look at this image of Alana Glazer from Broad City, where her costume actually is modeled on Judith, throughout the show, she and her co-star not only use the word Jewess, but reference back to this notion of Jewesses as externally feminized, internally masculinized, and racially ambiguous. And unfortunately, that sometimes becomes an opportunity for racial appropriation on the show. Because, for instance, there is a scene where Alana wants to sneak into a club. and she sees a party in front of them with the last name Hernandez, being like, we're a private party, our name is Hernandez, anybody who's with us, can come in. And so then she walks up and like misrepresents herself as Latina to say, I'm with the Hernandez party. And I think if a lighter complected performer like Amy Schumer did that, it would be sort of more obviously jarring. But because Ilana's character is always already positioned on the sort of a line between white and non-white, her racist transgressions like that don't come across as quite so blatant. Another term for this, who's heard the term blackfishing or brownfishing? Can someone give us a definition? Yes?
Blackfishing or brownfishing is like when you intentionally make yourself look like a black or brown person.
Exactly. So it's a form of minstrelsy in when a white presenting person uses cosmetics or other cues to encourage others to misread them as actually black or Latinx or another identity of color. But because Ilana's Jewess identity is already sort of on that line, it's not always so obvious that she is stealing other identities when she, for example, tiptoes into Latinidad or blackness.
But in a sense, she's taking advantage of her so-called ambiguity.
Yes, absolutely.
And so it seems like there's deviance around Jewish gender in general, right? That sort of the Jewish feminine is either too exotic or too seductive or too internal, whereas the Jewish male is too female but also very threatening. And that there are all of these kind of age-old stereotypes about gender that exist covertly in our pop culture.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, there is this long history of imagining Jewish bodies as not just different, but also deviant and sort of disturbing. And more broadly, gender and sexual stereotypes are part of almost all racial stigmas. Like if you think about racial stereotypes about black men and black women and how black men and black women are imagined in pop culture to have a different type of masculinity or femininity than white men and white women, or how Asian men are stereotyped differently from black men or white men. So actually for all groups in our society, including for white Gentiles, there are certain assumptions about like what type of gender will go with what color or ethnicity. Like if you think about the phrase, all-American football player, and the image that conjures. It conjures generally a white Gentile, probably blonde, Midwestern guy from a small town who is like, has a sort of masculinity that is imagined as powerful but not dangerous and as somehow good for the community. Whereas often stereotypes about black masculinity, not that you need a white guy to tell you, are imagined as powerful in a way that is supposedly dangerous and a threat to society, and particularly white society. So the stereotypes on Jewish gender and sexuality are just one facet of this, and a phrase that we use in gender studies and critical race studies to talk about all these different dynamics is the phrase racially queer, to describe how all different types of racially stigmatized groups are imagined to have gender and sexuality that is excessive or deficient or deviant or dirty or corrupting in some way.
So can we bring it back to Drake? And,
Yeah.
in terms of his masculinity, his Jewishness, his Canadianness, his bar mitzvah.
Yes. Yeah, so I think I know where you're going. Show of hands, who watches Saturday Night Live? Who has seen Drake's bar mitzvah on Saturday Night Live? Who would like to? A few hands? Okay. Well, whether you'd like to or not, we're going to. So we're going to watch about a 3-minute sketch from Saturday Night Live when Drake reenacted his bar mitzvah on the show. And I would actually then like to have a conversation with you all about what you all noticed in terms of race, gender, and sexuality and religion in this clip. How is it portraying Jewish characters and black characters? How does Drake move between these stereotypes? There's a lot to process. Oh no, the sound. Let's see if the sound is going to work for us. Worst case scenario, I can always put my mic up to the microphone output. Here we go.
Here's another fun fact. I'm Jewish.
Oh. Yes, this is the picture of Scott. stuck out to you all? What did you notice in terms of stereotypes about Jewishness and blackness? How about this? Everybody take 1 minute, turn to one person next to you, talk about what you all noticed, and then we'll reconvene. Go for it. Had you seen this one before? Oh yeah, 100%.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like at first I was like, oh, I was like, wait, this is really not funny because I felt like it was, you know how you talk about the white POC binary kind of and how scholars discussion that, but also like it felt so binary, where it's like let's have some wild stereotypes about this and this, and you know that like they can't be reconciled and that they're just like just offensive, like sweeping in all directions.
And even when he's rapping, he almost sort of thinks like, I can play ball, I know what a W2 is. And so even in this moment, it's like, this is a black Jewish bar mitzvah, and yet somehow they're so separate and so stereotyped. And there's even moments when he laughs, like he chuckles at his own voice, and is therefore giving the audience permission to do it. And you know, SNL's audience, it's almost all white. And yeah, so it's a really interesting conversation.
And also the way the mom is like, what was it, your name is Jacob? That's kind of also a historical stereotype of the overbearing Jewish mother.
As masculinity, absolutely. He can't become a man until she exits the stage.
And it's interesting, like, what is he trying to achieve? Like, is he trying to sort of show us the possibility of these things, that this is all that it can lead to because we somehow don't have a space for it properly? Or...
And also, like, who even wrote this? Because it probably wasn't so like, come in, everybody?
Yes.
All right, everybody, welcome back. So now, I know people have things to say, because I heard you say them. So, what do y'all want to talk about? Yes, thank you for being brave.
I don't know what a W-2 is. That's very stereotypical.
And what is the stereotype?
That Jewish people are always working with money, obsessed with money.
Right, the stereotype of Jewish people as good with money, and that sort of relates to the joke when Uncle Larry says, like, here's a savings bond for $18. So like very little money. And I think generally when a Jewish character does something like that, the assumption is that he's not poor, he's cheap. And so that this assumption that he has a lot but is somehow stingy with it. What are other stereotypes about Jewishness and blackness that y'all noticed? Yes?
This like kind of shows differences of like racial identities as well. Like you have the mom who has a more like what would be perceived as like a typical Jewish accent with a Jewish mother, and then you have his father that's like, oh, Torah, I did it in high school, and so it's like the stereotype of more African American families having like these more exaggerated names for like their kids and like their families and stuff like that, whereas the other way it's more the accent.
So I'm really glad you brought up this moment. To dive in a little deeper, as you said, Drake's mother is depicted with a New York accent. Does anyone know where Drake's mother is from? Not New York. She's Canadian. Does anyone know what Drake's mother's hair looks like? It's straight and blonde. So it's really interesting that even in this reenactment of real people who were alive and may even have been in the audience, that when the SNL cast was like, how do we design this sketch and how are we going to present the Jewish characters, that they drew on these physical stereotypes about Jewish bodies, how Jews are supposed to sound, but also supposedly how Jews are supposed to look, like the wavy or curly dark hair. And then, as you also said, there's the depiction, kind of insulting depiction of the black side of Drake's family, including the fact that Drake's dad doesn't just say that he like knew women with these names, but implies that he like slept with them on the road. So this depiction of black men as hypersexual or womanizing. And there's at least one other moment in the sketch when we get those vibes. Did anybody catch it? Yes.
Yeah, it's when like the uncle on like the black side of Drake's family like says, it's essentially kind of implies that he's bringing a woman that he's not married to Drake's bar mitzvah.
Yes, absolutely. He has brought his mistress to the bar mitzvah because he's like, here's Auntie Rhonda. Drake's like, where's Auntie Kim? And his uncle Barry's like, oh, she's back at the house. And so this presentation of black men is both clownish and hypersexual. And I should add, even though in the context of this sketch it's presented quite lightheartedly, as I'm sure everybody knows, stereotypes of black hypersexuality have served to promote all sorts of violence in America. So much of the violence against black people, including specifically black men, has been based on this notion that black men are supposedly a threat to white women. So and even for instance, when it came to school desegregation in the South, part of the racist argument against integration was the accusation that if black boys were in school with white girls, that they supposedly wouldn't be able to control their sexuality and would assault white girls. So these stereotypes that are presented so lightheartedly come out of a really ugly history, and for some viewers may actually be reinforcing those views. I also want to point out, does Drake come across as, well, let me take a step back. These stereotypes we're describing about Drake's dad and uncle, does Drake seem to fit the same stereotypes as them? Okay, I saw you shake your head. Can I ask why?
Well, he's just responding to both of them, but he doesn't really exhibit any of the stereotypes himself besides rapping about it.
Absolutely. So he has these two uncles who are clownish in opposite ways, the hypersexual black uncle and the sort of twitchy, neurotic, emasculated Jewish uncle. But Drake is somehow presented as in the middle and above both of them. There's even this interesting moment, right, when he is physically balancing between them, that's not a great shot, but physically balancing between them on the stage, and that there's this notion that they are both extreme and clownish in some way, and that he is the debonair exception. Even on the level of his clothing, it's the only clothing that fits, and the clothing that most evenly mixes whiteness and blackness. And even in his speech, right? So his uncle speaks this kind of clownish, exaggerated version of African-American vernacular English. His Jewish uncle can't seem to decide whether he's trying to have a Yiddish accent or a Brooklyn accent. But Drake really doesn't do either of those. He mostly speaks like, quote, standard, meaning often white and middle class American English. And so there's this way in which he's presented as free from the stigmas that get loaded onto these other two, which is really striking. And even that, when the other two uncles mess up and he chuckles at them, he's thereby giving permission for the audience to chuckle at them. And show of hands, please remind me, who has ever watched an episode of SNL? What color is the audience mostly? White. So there's something actually really contradictory about this sketch that's woo, multicultural breakthrough, black Jewish Canadian bar mitzvah boy, first ever national broadcast, or one of very few, with a Jewish person of color, but it's also then using this Jewish person of color to invite the audience into snickering at Jewish and black characters who have not assimilated as well as Drake has. Were there other aspects of the sketch that people wanted to bring up? Then one other thought I'll throw out there. Uncle Larry, the Jewish uncle, he speaks with a sort of quavery voice. I think everybody probably could catch that these were stereotypes about Jewish speech, but it may not be immediately obvious what these stereotypes of speech have to do with race. Historically, in 19th century pseudoscience, some of the racial accusations against Jews were the accusations that Jews supposedly had physically different throat muscles and facial muscles, which would supposedly produce racially different voices. And specifically for men, voices that were quavery, breaky, feminized, kind of gay-sounding, but certainly not blush. And voices that could never assimilate because they were supposed to be physically different in some way. And so I think for the audiences watching this sketch, including all of us, even if we don't know that history at all, we do somehow know, we have absorbed the notion that Jewish voices might sound certain ways. Even when we don't know these racial histories, these histories are with us and are actually intersecting with the way that we perceive Uncle Larry's whiteness. Also, by the way, the actor who plays Uncle Larry, Kyle Mooney, is not Jewish. So he is certainly doing a kind of Jew voice, which I would argue actually produces a sort of Jew face.
Interesting. And, I think a lot of these elements might fly under the radar, right? Because I think with very good reason, we are trained to look at discrimination and targetedness through the lens of color, right? With very good reason. And yet, when there's other elements such as, the voice or even, things that are more subtle, we might miss it. And I wonder how much of this also relates to a part of anti-Semitism, which is that it's often not acknowledged, right? That the idea that when Jews claim anti-Semitism, and listen, anti-Semitism, as we all know, is also weaponized and exploited sometimes to shut down very legitimate critiques. But at the same time, it's often also just gone totally unnoticed, or that when it's pointed out, it's said, Jews are just trying to claim some kind of right. So I guess what I'm asking is this also something that is often missed?
It is and it isn't, because that audience and our audience, for instance, understood that Uncle Larry was supposed to sound Jewish, even if we didn't understand why we understood it, or where that insight came from. And so frequently people are perceiving through the lens of anti-Semitism, even if they don't know it. And that's not only non-Jews, by the way. So I remember a really interesting moment when I came home from college and showed my mom a picture of me and my friends, and she was really surprised that one of my friends who had blonde hair was Jewish. And she said, the blonde one? And so even for Jewish communities, there are these internalized notions of Jewish bodily difference. But then going back to your point about how frequently when Jews speak about experiences with anti-Semitism, we are dismissed as, at best being whiny, and at worst actually being kind of deceptive and manipulative. I think there are two sort of aspects to that. One is that there are anti-Semitic stereotypes that depict Jews as either whiny or manipulative, and that actually then makes it very difficult to name your experience. More broadly, almost all minoritized groups are often treated as untrustworthy sources. Think about the notion that when women speak about their experiences, sorry, I guess this is sort of mansplaining, so feel free to interrupt me. But when women speak about your experiences and you're told that you're being hysterical or over-emotional or whatever, and that's a way of disbelieving you about your experiences. Or frequently for people of color, being stereotyped as, quote, over-emotional or not intelligent, and therefore discounted as sources of knowledge about your own experiences. When it comes to Jews, Jews are often imagined as either whiny or deceptive, which then make great excuses to disbelieve us when we talk about anti-Semitism. But I think another reason why this happens actually comes from a more earnest place of fear, that so many of us feel all the time that we have to choose between either analyzing anti-Semitism or analyzing color-based racism and white privilege. And so this creates a lot of fear in all directions. I know plenty of white-skinned Jewish people who feel a lot of hesitation about addressing color-based racism and white privilege, not because they don't know it's a problem, but for fear that if we name our white privilege, it will then disregard our encounters with anti-Semitism, some of which rise to the level of physical danger. And then conversely, I have conversations with a lot of folks who fear, and even have a really kind of gut-level fear, that if we speak about anti-Semitism, that must automatically mean distracting from or discounting the problem of color-based racism and white privilege. And if you take one thing out of this talk, it's the idea that we don't have to choose. And in fact, we can't choose, because both of these things are happening all the time, whether we deal with them or not. So if we don't deal with them, we're just doing it wrong. And so one of my hopes, actually, with these examples from popular culture is to offer people tools to see that we don't have to choose, we can't just choose. Think of them as two dimensions of race, the white people of color binary and the Jewish Gentile binary, that are always happening simultaneously, always intersecting, and thinking about both of them only enhances our grasp on both.
Fascinating, and also very freeing, and also a lot of responsibility is placed on our shoulders, which is good. Yeah. So, what do you have any hopes for, I guess, the future of pop culture and representation, and Jewish representation and other representation?
I do. I hope that ChatGPT will finally come out of the closet. But aside from that, in terms of representations of Jewishness, something that is already happening that I hope to see a lot more of is an ongoing diversification of Jewish identities in pop culture. And whereas this representation is sort of played for jokes, it's like, can you believe a black Jewish person? Instead, that there are more and more representations that really fully embrace and speak from the experiences of people who are Jewish and black, Jewish and Asian, Jewish and Latinx, Jewish and Native American. So for example, show of hands, who watched Reservation Dogs? Heard of Reservation Dogs? If you haven't, go home right now, skip your other reading, binge this show. It is a really wonderful show. It is the first one with an first North American show with an all-indigenous writing staff and production staff, and almost all indigenous cast. The executive producer is Taika Waititi, who is both Maori and Jewish. And even though none of the characters on the show are Jewish, one of the leading ladies is a biracial Native Canadian and Jewish performer who has spoken a lot about her Native and Jewish identities outside the context of the show. And she is now in a new movie that has just come out and is sort of like doing the indie film circuit called Floaters, which is a Jewish summer camp movie where she plays like the head of a Jewish summer camp. And even though it's never completely explicit that her character is also Native, there are a number of hints along the way. Like, for example, her clothing at some points kind of incorporates Native artistic motifs. So that would make her the first Native American and Jewish character ever in North American pop culture. There's also a really interesting comedian called Joanna Hausman, who is Venezuelan American and Jewish, and if you Google her, her stuff will come right up, and she does a lot of comedy about kind of poking fun at other people's confusion about her existence as a very white-presenting Latina and Jewish person whose body just like disrupts all sorts of social expectations. So I hope we will get more and more diverse representations of Jewishness.
It's fascinating. Should we do questions? Questions from the audience?
Question?
This is fascinating. Thank you very much. I have a question about the musical performers and sort of history and timeline, and sort of influence of other performers. So you're talking about Fran Drescher and Jerry Seinfeld as sort of slowly but surely opening the door for these later performers to come out of the closet, so to speak. I think in music this actually started happening in the late 1980s into the mid-1990s, and I'm thinking of the Beastie Boys, one that is particularly close to my heart, the band Fish.
Yes.
And Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song really changed the game dramatically for Jewish performers in this same vein. What role did, let's say Adam Sandler or maybe the others, play in opening the door for Lil Dicky for sure, and maybe Drake as well?
Great question. So the Beastie Boys are so interesting because, as you all may know, they were one of the first groups, in some arguments, the first group to really bring hip-hop to mainstream white middle-class audiences, which of course was a form of appropriation, and were, I believe the entire group, or at least the entire original group, were Jewish and white presenting. But what's so interesting is that even though they never exactly hid their Jewishness, their lyrics don't reference Jewishness until 2004. You know, I think at least 2 decades, maybe more after their debut album. And so there was a way in which they too were not as frontally Jewish as perhaps they could have chosen to be. You're certainly right that Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song was a breakthrough moment. Show of hands, who's heard of Adam Sandler? Who's seen Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song? Okay, a fair number of people. So for those who may not be familiar, this was on Saturday Night Live. I believe the first time was 1992 or 1993, when Adam Sandler got up on stage with his guitar and sort of sang this song, saying, like, for all you Jewish kids out there at Christmas time where you don't see yourself on screen, here's a song for us. But then, more than that, he outs a whole bunch of stars as Jewish. He's like, I bet you didn't know that all these stars are also lighting Hanukkah candles. And it was this kind of meta moment of somebody on a national broadcast being like, hey, Hollywood has a closeting problem with certainly also with gayness, but also with Jewishness, that for the first time, we're not just going to let this pass uncommented. We're going to actually mock the fact that so many performers in Hollywood are under pressure to closet their Jewishness. And then every couple of years, he always updates his Hanukkah song with new names of people to call out. But it was this moment, and also I think the fact that it did not harm his popularity and maybe even increased it was this sort of barometer of the idea that you could now begin to more openly speak about Jewishness and that you wouldn't automatically be seen as unmarketable. And then just one last thought is that certainly Adam Sandler not only would fit into the realm of music, but the realm of comedy. And certain kinds of comedy have always been like the one realm where Jews could be more open, particularly stand-up in the early 20th century. So there were a number of very transgressive Jewish women comedians, as well as men like Lenny Bruce. So a Lenny Bruce joke that I will not repeat here. He more than once made jokes about Jews killing Jesus and was like, totally leaning into that at a time when many performers were not explicitly using the word Jew at all. So comedy has often been like the place where those transgressions could happen, even in more closeted eras.
Questions?
Thanks so much to both of you. And Jonathan is incredibly interesting. I have so many questions, but I'll try to hone in on one. And I'm wondering aloud, I think these two questions are related. I haven't really formulated this thought yet, but here we go. I'm wondering about this type of comedy, which is obviously over the top, right? Which is, I would assume, part of, it's not a subtle skit, right? So that's part of what these, forget Drake, the other comedians are doing, right? If we've seen them in other sketches. I wonder aloud of how comedians can bring attention to the ridiculousness of these stereotypes without reinforcing them like they do here. And I think this is related, and if it's not, we can talk about it afterwards. Your comment about Alana Glazer and her appropriation of Latina identity in line to get into the dance club and pretending she was part of the Hernandez party. I wonder aloud if comedy can play a role, or entertainment plays a role in the same way that bringing attention to how ridiculous these stereotypes are is problematic because it can reinforce them. I don't know if it's the converse or not, but in Alana Glazer's embracing of the shape-shifting stereotype of Jews, and her leaning into it and saying, okay, for centuries people have said that Jews literally can change shapes and ridiculous things like that. I'm going to lean into that and make fun of it and even exploit that. I don't know, there's a question there of an attempt of the way in which, when is it acceptable and when is it not, right? This is over the top. One could say that her acting in that is appropriation, no doubt. So then I'm just totally in an unformulated way, because no one else was asking the question, of how you can bring attention to these really problematic and historically heavy and sometimes violent and in certain cases genocidal, like when you take it to an extreme, Jews, blacks, whoever, of how to bring attention to it in entertainment without reinforcing it simultaneously.
Great questions. If I understood the first question, it was, I think, about subtler forms of comedy. Show of hands, who has seen or heard of the TV series Fleischman is in Trouble? So if you haven't seen it, it's a dramedy from a few years ago. Interesting. But it's certainly much more lifelike than this comedy, and deals in interesting ways with stereotypes about Jewish men and women, and particularly the way it contrasts two different Jewish characters, one of whom is presented as kind of stereotypically emasculated and neurotic, but one of whom actually has this kind of sex appeal with women, and that's his whole thing, that like everybody wants to be with him. There's also a new movie coming out with, I believe, Kristen Bell, it's called Nobody Wants This. It's on Netflix, and it's where she plays a non-Jewish woman who falls in love with a rabbi played by Adam Brody from the OC. And so that like less over-the-top comedy, which is either sometimes embracing or sometimes inverting stereotypes about Jews, can be really interesting sites to analyze. But then your question about like when Jewish performers take stereotypes about Jews and like play them up, is the effect to puncture them or just to reinforce them? And I think it's totally double voiced. Like it totally does both at once. Who's seen Borat? Heard of Borat? Okay, so for those who may not know, Borat by Sacha Baron Cohen, it's like a mockumentary in which he's a Jewish actor. He plays a very, very anti-Semitic and homophobic and misogynist reporter from Kazakhstan who's sort of on the loose in America. And like literally repeats all sorts of anti-Semitic stereotypes, including the shape-shifting myth. There's a scene where he accuses Jewish hotel owners of having shape-shifted into cockroaches. There's a scene where he's, I think, in a gun shop asking like what types of guns should be used for different occasions. And he's like, and what about for a Jew? And the gun shop owner's like, well, then you use this one. And so there was a lot of controversy when that movie came out. Is he showing us how ridiculous these stereotypes are? Are we supposed to look at this and be like, oh my God, I can't believe anybody believes that we turn into cockroaches? Or is it just reinforcing it? And I think the answer is both. I think there were some audiences who watched Borat and were like, oh my God, like who could believe this? And there were some audiences who were like, I knew it. And so I think, same thing for SNL, same thing for Alana Glazer's work on Broad City. I think it can go both ways, and that is really concerning.
I just had to articulate what I wanted to say, but not to put emphasis on generational labels, but we have discussed how these issues of racial antisemitism, masculinity, and white supremacy have affected Jewish people throughout the 1990s, 2000s, and our recent history. But I'm curious as to how this conversation translates to now and the future. So what are the effects that Generation Z is feeling, and how will it impact them?
Great question, and I think time will tell. That may sound like a cop-out, but I didn't do interviews for the book, neither with the performers nor with audiences, and that was a very conscious decision to think about like how much material can I process, and I had to watch a lot of drink, and so I had to decide whether or not I could make interviews work as well. So I have not personally interviewed folks from Gen Z about their experiences with anti-Semitism, and I think we're still in the process of seeing Gen Z performers act that out on screen. So for example, are y'all familiar with the TV show Andy Mack? So that was Disney's first ever piece of media with an openly Jewish character. The character Cyrus Goodman came out in 2019, actually in the middle of an episode about his grandmother's Shiva, or Jewish mourning ceremony. So I would be interested in like a couple of years to hear what that actor has to say about what it's been like what it was like to play that role of both the first openly gay Disney character simultaneously being a Jewish character, and how maybe that has impacted other parts of his career. So yes, I also am very curious about that, but cannot speak definitively to it.
Hi, so I'm Jewish and I'm blonde and I don't look like the stereotypical Jew. And there's been like countless times in my life where I tell people that I'm Jewish and they're like, "Whoa, you're Jewish? I would have never guessed that." And like I've always just kind of like froze and not really known like what to say. Like, do you have a good like response when someone says that?
Great question. First of all, thank you so much for sharing that experience with us. And I also want to affirm that it sounds like there have been times when that experience is painful, and I'm really sorry that you have encountered that. I think for all of us, actually, of all identities, whenever anybody makes a microaggression against us, we have to sort of decide a quick calculation of things about where we are, who we're talking to, what our relationship is with them, and what we hope we can accomplish with them. For me, certainly for me, when I make those decisions, it has to do with physical safety. Where are we? Is it safe for you to call somebody out, or perhaps call them in and challenge them about their thoughts? And particularly if it's somebody that you have a good enough relationship with, that you feel like there's a strong enough connection that you can have this conversation, then I think it's very helpful to start with open-ended questions and just like say, first start kind of meta-observing. Wow, like your reaction was really strong. You seemed really surprised. Can you say more about why you were so surprised? And then when folks articulate that, then that's an opportunity to be like, you know, I'm hearing you describe really specific stereotypes about how Jews look. Where did those ideas come from for you? And so sort of gently inviting people to reflect can frequently be very effective. So that's one approach, but also you gotta do what you gotta do and what makes you feel right and safe in those moments.
Hi, thank you. I had a question about, you were talking about how Zac Efron in some of his roles presents what you call goy face, or what you even said in your lecture as like Gentile, like minstrelsy kind of. What do you think is like transgressive about this? Because it seemed like you felt like there was something important happening here, that as a Jewish performer, there was sort of like a wink-wink inside joke that he was performing this like hilarious, outlandish Gentile stereotype character, versus how is it regressive or related to the way that Jews in Hollywood often feel the need to be closeted, and then I guess bouncing back to the Adam Sandler song, outing Jews in Hollywood, like how do you bounce back and forth between like, is it interesting and helpful, or transgressive in any way for Jews to perform goy face, or is it closeted and evidence of something that we need to move on from?
Great question, and the answer always is it depends. So there certainly can be performances where minoritized groups are poking fun at majority groups and sort of encouraging those groups to think critically about themselves. My interpretation of Zac Efron's goy face films is that they seem at first to do that critique, but ultimately just renew white, straight, Gentile male dominance in a form that feels less guilty. Because initially, each of Zac Efron's goy face characters sort of performs the worst stereotypical stereotypes of white Gentile masculinity. He's entitled, he's aggressive, he's thoughtless to people of color and women and Jews. There's a moment when he sees text written in Hebrew and he goes, "It's written in Jewish," instead of in Hebrew, which is like a very quintessential mistake that implies a lack of cultural awareness. And over the course of each goy face film, his character gets sort of brought down to earth through comedic punishments by minoritized characters, such as Jewish characters or people of color who sort of embarrass him or like teach him that he's not all that. But then at the end of each movie, this experience has not actually reduced his privilege just looks nicer. So for instance, in Neighbors 2, sorry for spoilers, it's been a few years that it's out at this point. In the beginning of Neighbors 2, Teddy's character gets kicked out of his house. He's been living with his good friend from college who is gay, and his roommate is like ready to get partnered with a man and focus on having a family, so Zac Efron's character gets kind of booted out, and that's the beginning of his series of comedic humiliations throughout the film. But at the end of the film, he actually ends up taking his sex appeal and his expertise in frat parties to become a gay wedding planner. And so at the end of the movie, he's not just back on good terms with the gay couple, he is literally commanding their wedding. He has a headset, he's in the like church or wherever they're having a wedding, and he's like, bride or groom goes here, groom goes there, music, etc. So it's this kind of vision in which he can simultaneously be reformed into a nicer, sweeter version of white Gentile masculinity that is compatible with a progressive future, but in which his evolution only helps him be better in charge. And on that note, over the course of each goy face film, his physical goy face fades. So for example, he stops making these really extreme facial expressions that are sort of rageful or, quote, meat-headed, and instead becomes much sweeter. Or actually, in order to create this image of almost like scary muscles, Zac Efron practiced like deliberate self-dehydration before the filming of some of these scenes, but then at the end of each goy face movie, he's clearly been hydrating because he no longer looks so like scary. It's a more sort of aesthetically pleasing version of muscularness, or it's framed that way. And so it's really interesting that even as the goy face mask fades, it does not reveal a Jewish performer who's like laughing about it. Instead, he fades from a goy face kind of monster into a lovable and beautiful white Gentile hero. And that's why, perhaps against intuition, a lot of mainstream audiences enjoy consuming this because they're only poke fun at white Gentile masculinity in order to refresh it in less criticizable form. I think there was another part of your question that I might have missed.
What is the relationship of that dynamic with the closeted nature of Jews in Hollywood and Adam Sandler calling people out for not being open about their Jewishness?
Great question. I think particularly within Jewish communities, but maybe actually a lot of communities, there's this notion, there's sort of like very clear good-bad dichotomy that if you are closeted about your identity, that is shameful and kind of self-betraying, and if you are open about your identity, that is like progress for the community. But it's not always that straightforward, and I think a good example of this is Lil Dicky, who we spoke about a little bit before. And Lil Dicky not only visually Jewfaces himself on screen, but really plays up the most degrading stereotypes about Jewishness. So like, he has a music video called Save That Money, where he describes himself as a cheap Jew business major. There are also times when he refers to himself by the slur kike, which is short for Christ killer, but is also a racial slur against Jews that's really now only used by white supremacists. He describes himself as a dirty Jew. He describes, focuses on his curly hair. And so I don't know if it's doing anything great for Jewish representation that he's like, look at how Jewish I am, and here are like all these most degrading stereotypes that I essentially have made my costume out of. So I really think it always depends on how it's done.
I think that's a good stopping place. Do you have some closing comments or thoughts?
I mean, just thank you for sharing all of this fine-grained and fun and thought-provoking analysis with us. And these are obviously complex times, and so I feel like we're all coming out with so many tools to help us navigate them, and to also see, I guess maybe this is already kind of known to, but that pop culture is something that we consume and enjoy, and also, can teach us how to be in the world and hopefully how to not be in the world. So thank you for all of those tools and all of your wonderful research.
Thank you so much for having me, and have a great night, everybody.